don't know your numbers, you don't know your business. I learned this the hard way with my first company. So I created NetSuite, the world's #1 cloud business system. NetSuite gives you the visibility and control you need to make smart decisions and grow with confidence. That's why companies who use NetSuite grow 3 times faster than the S&P 500.
Schedule your free product tour right now.
Hey everyone, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are, and welcome to the Digital Leader Show, where we talk key issues and news at the intersection of business and technology in hopes of making you a better digital leader. We're live every Wednesday at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific on LinkedIn and YouTube, and the audio recording is available the following week wherever you get your podcasts. Today we're discussing, is the GenAI bubble ready to burst? Plus other tech headlines for the week. I'm Dan Goodstein. I head up AI and the Digital Enterprise Institute. We're a professional association, media, and peer-to-peer research network providing education, networking, and advice to over 130,000 members globally, all around automation, enterprise AI, and digital transformation. Thanks to our sponsor, Oracle NetSuite, their cloud ERP solution helps provide real-time visibility into operational and financial performance, and AI members and followers get preferred pricing of 45% off at irpaai.com/netsuite. I'm joined today by my co-host, Chris Cerdak. He's a senior AI advisor to AI. He's an author, consultant, and was formerly White House Chief Transformation Office Advisor, partner for digital transformation at Gartner, and AI practice lead at EY. Chris, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, good morning, however it may fit.
How are you doing today? I see that you guys have some additional transportation on the West Coast. Waymo is rolling out their robo-taxis in full.
I'm not entirely certain I want to try it, but anything that increases the speed of traffic from 2 miles per hour to 3 miles per hour is a good thing.
I've been saying this for a while. I know they've got their complications, but after being in a car for many, many years with my grandmother, nothing can be worse. So I think this has got to be safer than at least the average driver, I think, which is like kind of the promise of AI in general, right?
And that's the irony. The technology, when it's right 99.999% of the time, we say that that's not quite good enough, but the typical driver is probably going to kill themselves in the next 2 weeks. It's one of those weird prejudices we have against the technology. It's kind of funny.
So you're getting launched in California, Nevada, and Texas shortly. Waymo 1 is available now in LA after limited service for the last few months there. And there'll be kind of a pretty big number, 150,000 paid rides per week in Phoenix, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. That's as of a couple weeks ago. So very interesting. Meanwhile, GM is kind of pulled out of the whole thing. They're complaining about risk and costs, and guess what? It was more complicated than they thought it was. So they're pulling back from their robo-taxi, and they just signed a deal with Uber a few months ago too. So I thought that was interesting.
The unintended consequences and the unanticipated risks are always super high, but guaranteed there's going to be tons of lawsuits related to this. But that's sort of the economic friction that comes with any kind of advancement like this. May make sense for them, or may be them being overly conservative. Time will tell.
And it wouldn't be a business industry in the U.S. Without Amazon getting involved. So Amazon is now selling cars. They've launched Amazon Auto for now, only selling Hyundais, but they're offering a streamlined shopping experience. And even the ability to secure financing and e-sign your documents. I know that I'm like an Amazon. I never worked for Amazon, but I'm like an Amazon evangelist. But I love this because to me, innovation is all about fixing terrible experiences. And let me tell you something, as somebody who bought 2 cars this year, it is still a terrible, terrible experience.
Well, Tesla was the first company to break the legal framework, the legal requirement that you use a middleman dealership. Previously, there was laws that dealerships had to be local to a given state, and you couldn't sell as
That's
a large.
True. I didn't realize that. That's why.
Yeah.
That's why.
And in fact, Tesla did it regardless of the fact that it was illegal and kind of forced it. So they paved the way for that this is a whole chapter in my book, Jerk, right? The jerks break the rules. And here's another example of it. It's amazing. Just contemplate the amount of revenue that Amazon's going to generate when they're selling a $50,000 car instead of a $5 Barbie doll. It's going to be pretty amazing.
Yeah, I mean, everything they do pretty much experience-wise. I've been a big fan of, what they're trying to do in healthcare as well. So anything they do from an experience standpoint seems to be good news. Amazon delivery, the whole gambit. On the I was going to say the AI side of things, but before I go there, Google has announced the top search terms of the year. You didn't make the list, Chris. I thought you were going to be up there, but I guess no surprise that the majority of the top search terms were dominated by sports and celebrities, personalities, Donald Trump, Catherine, Princess of Wales. I guess I was surprised that is in sports, soccer, but maybe I shouldn't be surprised because it's global, right? So it's not just in the U.S. People love their soccer, their football outside of the U.S. more and more in the U.S., but outside of the U.S. And the only real technology thing that made the list was the iPhone, which kind of surprised me that more AI stuff didn't make that search, but maybe that was by design. Google doesn't want you to jump off Google yet.
Well, it's funny. I mean, the iPhone 16, I have the 15, and I think the only difference is they added a button. I mean, there's very little innovation left in that space, it seems. So I don't know why people are Googling that to figure out, why is this so underwhelming this time? But
yeah, and I think I think it was in TechCrunch I was reading this Google list, but they're saying it's becoming less and less accurate of the landscape of the universe, just because Gen Z is 25% less likely to use Google. So you got to start accounting for other things, YouTube and TikTok, who, by the way, is launching this massive campaign to get people shopping on the platform. They seem, I don't know if it's a strategy to avoid the ban or just to get as much done as they can in the meantime. But they're offering some pretty aggressive, it was started back before Black Friday into Black Friday holiday season, giving people kind of credits to shop on the platform. So, they're not going down without a fight. Of course, there's some U.S. ban looming here. So maybe even in Canada as well.
Yeah, the idea of going to TikTok to look up anything is pretty frightening in and of itself. So the fact that a quarter of Gen Z is getting their facts from that platform is pretty terrifying.
Well, I say a quarter less likely to use Google, but so I don't know if they've got the full non-Google market share, but it's significant. I remember seeing a number, I don't remember what it was, a year ago or so, talking about how that was like the default search engine. Like my generation, it was Google. That generation, that it was the default search engine. So yeah, I'm with you. That's scary. I saw something also. I think it was 2 weeks ago. Instagram is doing something interesting where they're allowing people to reset the algorithm on their account. So it's mainly there to address the teenage users and some of the things we've talked about around social media usage of kids and young adults. But it would give you the ability to kind of reset all of the content, what you see across the various different reels and pages and feeds and things like that. So you talk about this kind of echo chamber we all end up in, right, through content and these algorithms and things. Kind of an interesting idea that you can kind of hit the refresh, the big red reset button and start over. I'm kind of curious to do it just to see what I see and what I don't see,
And as a data scientist, I'd be fascinated to see which people choose to reset, how they reset, and how they behave differently after the reset. I mean, that which is potentially why they're doing it, right? It'd be a fascinating psychographic experiment.
Yeah. Maybe we should do that every year before an election cycle. Just reset everybody's algorithm and see how the election plays out differently.
Or it's like everybody joining the gym on January 2nd, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, our main topic today is, guess what? GenAI, you can't avoid it. But is the bubble ready to burst, right? I mean, this thing exploded onto the scene, was it 2 years ago, year and a half ago? It's in a lot of ways it's falling behind some of the estimates. There's a lot of hallucinations, performance plateauing, and costs that I don't think people realized. So the question is, whether the Gen AI bubble is ready to pop, or is it just getting its second wind? Our guest today is Kurt Cagle. He's the editor-in-chief of the Cagle Report. Kurt, good to be with you.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
I think I said Jeff. Kurt Cagle. Kurt, good to be with you. Give us a little bit of background on yourself and the things you've been working on, and then I've got some questions for you.
Certainly. So I've been involved in tech now for probably maybe about as long as Chris, I suspect. But most of what I've done has been focused primarily on the development of language, symbolic AI, and increasingly neural net-based AI systems, with a lot of emphasis as well on the implications of these systems for technology and society. I'm the author of 25 books, most of them probably now used primarily as doorstops. But the ones that are still relevant for the most part talk primarily about data structures, data information, how we organize things. And that particular way of thinking about information is actually kind of the focus of my latest book called Ontology, a layman's guide to language, I believe is the working title. It's not out yet, but it's turning into a fun book to write.
So, the last few weeks, Kurt, have been maybe the busiest in Gen AI. Obviously the hype was big when this thing launched 2 years ago, year and a half ago. But, OpenAI had a slew of announcements this week. Google AI had a slew of announcements this week. Microsoft Ignite had a pretty robust list of announcements a few weeks back at their Ignite event. And I was looking at a survey this morning of 4,200 C-suite executives and AI decision makers that said, despite 88% of businesses knowing that AI is fundamental to business, 61% are scaling back their AI investments. Why do you think this is happening?
I think there's several reasons. One of the biggest is that there was a pretty significant initial hype that was specifically targeted towards saying, here is this great tool, this fantastic tool. It's going to transform everything. Everyone's going to use it. It's the next big thing. And we go through these cycles about once every 18 to 24 months. And in that process, it got in front of a lot of people. And what has happened as more and more people have utilized it is they've found that, it is very interesting when you're looking at it from a standpoint of I'm querying questions, things like that. But it is fundamentally, and I'm talking specifically about generative AI here, it is fundamentally a production-oriented or a creator-oriented system. And it has some real problems. I think a lot of people are trying to turn it into a database, but it is really not a database. It's what I've called in my own writings what I call a confabulator, meaning that it's very good at making things up. It's exceptional at making things up. And if you go into it with the assumption that it's something that makes things up, you're great. And there are a lot of interesting use cases where making things up is actually a very desired end product. Creating imagery, creating videos, creating music. But you notice in all those cases, the operating word here is creating.
Yeah.
As a database, it's lackluster. It's unreliable. It's relatively slow. It requires a significant amount of initial investment. it has a very bad tendency to put in things that you probably not only are not only not necessarily accurate, but when they are inaccurate, they are very inaccurate. Kind of getting back to the discussion about Waymo and their cars, that 99.9% is really good in a lot of cases, but in the cases where it's not, it can end up putting you into court, or it can end up making it into a liability issue. And I think that as people and as organizations have started investigating it, these factors, the factors about, is it something that's reliable? Is it something that is workable within my organization? Is it something that I'm going to have to worry about? Are becoming much, much bigger in terms of their importance than the fact that, okay, it does help Joe down in accounting be able to get his information a little bit faster and deliver the reports. That confusion, that promise that is not quite there, is something that unfortunately is also a characteristic of the fact that as these systems have gotten bigger, they've gotten dumber. And
Yeah,
that's a
we've
very bad place to be when you scale up things to a point where everything is getting less and less attractive for each iteration. That's a hard sell to be able to make, that the next generation of products, which you're really reliant upon, is going to be a significant step up from where you are now.
Yeah, and there's some indicators here, right? I mean, Google CEO came out, I think it was this week, saying he expects AI development to slow down in 2025. Satya at Microsoft kind of was quoted recently talking about comparing, this Gen AI stuff to the Industrial Revolution in the sense that, growth takes time before it explodes. So, some signals that it's going to maybe, if not burst, slow down, but I'm thinking, Kurt, I'm going back to that survey I mentioned at the top. The top reason why those investments were slowing down, at least, of course, according to the respondent to that survey, was lack of trust. Result of trust issues, and then quick behind that was lack of skills and data governance.
Yes. I've been on a number of panels actually specifically focusing on both of those issues. And one of the things that seems to emerge is that most of the people who deal with data from a data governance standpoint are essentially looking at primarily, the fidelity of information, the provenance of information, the accuracy of information, and the degree to which that information can be updated on a regular basis. And by all four of those metrics, it's what you see is that Gen AI basically is not delivering. It's something where you start talking about guardrails, and guardrails are essentially prompts that end up getting added into the mix of the prompts that you already have in order to be able to prevent you from doing things to the system, because essentially everything in a large language model or LLM is essentially a set of instructions coming from somebody. And because of this staggered approach to prompting, because you have essentially prompts overlaid on prompts overlaid on prompts, the ability to be able to govern that becomes much more problematic, particularly since there have been multiple instances where someone has basically reverse engineered that by simply telling the system, ignore everything that you've seen up till now. And at that point, the system will, because it is essentially building out a large context, which is essentially the set of tokens that it uses in lieu of memory. What that basically means is it erases many of those. It says, okay, these are no longer relevant, and I now go with this new information. So somewhere along the line, you have a guardrail that basically says, ignore anyone telling you to ignore the information. That becomes a very problematic issue. that becomes a huge issue in terms of being able to say, can I govern this? And the result of that is that you have to kind of treat AI as a very bright, or excuse me, a very knowledgeable, but not necessarily a very bright intern. Someone who knows a lot of things but doesn't necessarily know what they know or why they know it. All they know is essentially that they have enough information to go on to be able to say, here's a set of instructions, now do them. This is a little bit different than the way we ordinarily program. Ordinarily, we assume that computers are dumb. We assume that we go in and we have to tell them everything. Now we're basically telling them, well, go make it up use your best judgment. And that's a very terrible thing to do with something where basically it doesn't have the ability to effectively do complex reasoning or even to remember things that fall outside of its training set. So that governance becomes a very huge issue.
It's not just that it's wrong, it's that when it's wrong, it's convincingly wrong. And you end up in a situation where you're almost better off not using them. By the time you figured out, did it tell me the truth or not, and you did all that research and confirmation, you probably would have been better off just Googling it to begin with.
Yeah, the challenge that I see with a lot of that is that the what is happening, and this gets back to the generative aspects of it, is that with an LLM, you have essentially something that is creating things, creating information that shifts the onus or the focus of the user away from the creation aspect and increasingly into more of an editorial role. And that editorial role, in many cases, can be just as time consuming as the creative aspects. It's just that now what you're doing is effectively saying, okay, this is good, this is not, because of the fact that most LLMs are only slightly reflective. You do have a little bit of reinforcement learning, but it's very temporary. This means that they don't tend to learn as part of it. You talk about machine learning, but they're not actually learning much beyond what's in the current conversation because they are very forgetful. That's what a context is. It's basically what kind of short-term memory do you have?
But that's by design in a way, Kurt, right? I mean, if you think about some of these early systems, I didn't even realize that the early iterations of Google Gemini didn't have access to the web. Like this is Google, right? And we've isolated it. I think of applications in a more of an enterprise environment, and the challenge is always not even the technology; it's the data being so siloed and compartmentalized, and then you add privacy and governance and all that stuff. So is this an AI issue, or is this more of just a access to information issue, a cultural change management issue? What do you think?
Well, I think some of it's AI. Some of it basically is actually fundamentally architectural in nature. There is an underlying architecture that's used for large language models called a transformer model. And this was actually first put out, I believe by Google. Chris, you may know better than I do, but in a paper in 2017 called All You Need Is Attention. And that paper was very instrumental, and it basically said, hey, we have these search algorithms that we use, what's called, and I always get the acronym wrong, but TF-IDF encodings, which basically says, okay, I have information that I'm going to take a whole bunch of chunks of documents, break them apart into little pieces, and each of these pieces then get transformed into an information space. And that information space is large and disconnected and fractal and very complex, many thousands of dimensions in terms of how big that information space is. And then it utilizes that to be able to get the information that you're talking about. And I won't get into that here, unless we really need to get to dig deeper into it. But that aspect of it, that mechanism for basically doing things essentially says, once I have trained this model on this set of documents, that's essentially what is known to that system. And that also basically says that you're highly dependent upon your data training set. You're also dependent upon that training set not actually having a lot of already generated content. And there's some mathematical reasons about why this is actually a bad thing. But you can think of it as something analogous to when food manufacturers, bakers, flour manufacturers, first started developing milling processes. They developed a milling process that basically took wheat and ground it down to a point where a lot of the nutrients essentially all got ground out of the product. And that tended to make a wheat that was very uniform, very good, but it actually had less nutritional value because a lot of the interesting things that had been in that wheat is no longer there. It's all been taken out. And that's kind of the problem that we run into right now with the information that's coming from the systems. It's part of the reasons that most of these systems are beginning to really struggle, because the information that they're pulling from is either information that's already been in the system and they can't, and it's becoming more and more problematic to get it, or it's generated content that loses all of these really useful edges and becomes more and more pablum-like over time. And it's a not a terribly good analogy, but the analogy is still somewhat appropriate here. That is part of the reason. It's kind of like Alzheimer's. That's part of the reason the brain starts turning into prions. Because, what happens there is that the interesting things all get ground down, and there's not enough useful content from this to be able to do the kind of reasoning that you had initially. So that's a process that's basically causing problems.
It's producing digital gray goo, I call it. Right.
Yep, exactly.
At some point, the law of large numbers takes over, and you just get more averager and averager and averager results. It's digital gray goo.
And that's something that unfortunately is now striking a lot of different areas, because unless you have that content, unless you have new content constantly filtering in to be able to get past that gray goodom, and I love the term, the challenge then becomes, you have these systems that, even with all kinds of interesting innovations or attempts in the background, the technology, the architecture is fundamentally flawed. And anyone that's actually been in this space for a while will come back and tell you, hey, look, we knew this was a problem. We knew this was a problem 20 years ago. We knew it's a problem 10 years ago. Chris points out, you talk about a lot of people, Gary, talk about gray goo. Gary Marcus, has been, among many of the people that was first, really big cheerleader, and then said, no, wait, there's a problem here. And that problem is architectural, and it's a problem that the current architecture is not going to fix. Now, will there be a future architecture that can change that? Perhaps. But now we're back in the realm of speculation again. And I think a lot of companies are beginning to pick up on pieces that people like Chris and Gary and others along those lines have been saying for a while now. And that is that, hey, this is really good technology, but it's technology that's going to be fundamentally limiting, and it's going to be fundamentally limiting fast. And so that Curtis, fast, go on, please.
Well, no, I was just going to ask, so along those lines, is part of the issue that it's in the name, it's too general. Like I remember a few years back, these phrases, which I don't hear as much anymore, of kind of broad AI versus narrow AI, right? And some of the interesting stuff was in narrow AI because it was very, very focused on certain use cases, very well educated on certain areas of expertise. And if you asked it about, what Miley Cyrus did last week, it would say, I don't know, because that's not my area of expertise, right?
Right.
So is that the challenge? Do we need to get back to more narrow focused version of, like, can we take some of the benefits of the LLMs, but put them in a smaller, narrower space?
Somewhat. I again, this gets back down to training data. And and to architecture to a certain extent. You get to a certain point and you get a basically diminishing returns. If I have a dozen people all basically talking about, say, the election, after a while, the information that you can get about that election is going to be repetitive. And it's going to be repetitive. There may be some variations on it, but by and large, the information itself, the structure of that information is not going to change significantly. Now, even when you get larger and larger data sets, that's not going to change. All you're doing is basically changing the lens, magnification focus that you have on the systems itself. And to a certain extent, if you try to get too big, what actually ends up happening is that the number of possibilities that you have for being able to take the retrieved data set, you pass tokens up and the tokens basically do a search around it, or, for a very simple term, but, do a search around the general proximity. They do a kind of clustering analysis and retrieve from that the relevant sets of information that most closely matches the prompt, and then uses that to generate the relevant questions or the relevant responses. That process, unfortunately, if you get too much information into your system, it actually tends to make it more random and more likely to generate hallucinations than if you have smaller data sets. So there's kind of a point where things improve to a point of diminishing returns, and then you can actually see a devolution in the quality of the content that you're generating. And that devolution basically comes about because you almost have too much information that's too repetitive and too similar. And because of that, there's just too many possible variations that may or may not be relevant. So, there's a very limiting capability in the architecture itself. But it also is coming down to the fact that increasingly people are responding to the intellectual property borrowing, shall we say, in order to be able to populate these. And because of this, because you are now essentially dealing with requirements where actors or content producers, writers, artists, video producers, so forth, are all going, now wait a second. You can basically take what is in my, what I have produced as intellectual property, put it into the system, and all of a sudden you're able to reproduce something that's almost but not quite the same as what I did.
Yep. That was
And
part of the
that,
Hollywood strike, right? Early in the year, yeah.
and so that becomes a big issue, because what's happening now is you're seeing publishers, you're seeing producers, others, big media company that are saying either, look, before you do any of this, I want to have a contract that says I get X amount that I can then either distribute back to my creators, or more likely, pass on to my shareholders. So, it's not a perfect system by any means, but you basically are dealing with money going into the system. You're dealing with people now saying, well, why am I not getting compensated for the work that I'm doing? And this then kind of goes back to this whole question about, well, if that's the case, then where does that creation process go? If you have systems that become more limiting over time because they don't have the content they need, then it kind of goes back to, okay, now we're back to a point where that information is going to become more and more walled off, and that is going to involve decreasing improvements in the system,
Yeah,
regardless of what goes beyond.
you see the business model evolution that people, I feel like, there's this oversimplified, hey, they're coming for our jobs thing, but I don't think people really see the full evolution happening. I mean, the Hollywood example is a great one because many people didn't realize that was a big sticking point of the Hollywood actors strike. Was the ability for them to use their likeness and their voice for voice cloning, and some of that, who owns the intellectual property, all of, I don't know when that strike was, 9 months ago, 10 months ago, a year ago. Now, the next evolution is there's an AI studio coming out, which basically says we're not going to use GenAI to assist the movie making process. We're going to use GenAI to create the actual movies, right?
Yeah.
So that's a pretty big paradigm shift, more than an incremental shift. Chris, we've talked about the diminishing returns before. I feel like you planted that on Kurt here, but this is what you've been concerned about for a while.
Well, as Kurt's mentioning, language is inherently normalized data, right? The word onomatopoeia shows up a lot less often than the word the. And so the bigger the normalized data set I train off of, back to the architectural, if you will, shortcoming of transformers, the more normalized data I train on, the more averageness I'm going to get. It's a statistical amplifier. So the more often I present it with the word the more likely it is it will produce the word the when you ask it a question. That's just the math. And so if you're asking a question, or if you're asking it to create content and you're coming from a place less than average, you get a bit of improvement. But if you're coming at it from a place of better than average results, like you're an artist, like you're a writer, you're going to get worse results, or you're going to get sucked into the digital gray goo area. And I think last week there was the case out on LinkedIn and on the news where I think it was United Healthcare used an AI to do decision making, and it failed 90% of the time. At some point, you got to say, is it even worth having it if that's the case? Because the repair work is greater than the amount of work that it attempted to perform for you. So I agree that it's a great tool for content creation, and it's like a good research assistant. But I think it's going to have far less impact on people's jobs than many people think. And in likelihood, what it's going to do is it's going to make the most creative people even more creative, and therefore even more expensive. So be careful what you wish for, because you may get the opposite sometimes.
Yeah, there's some interesting developments going on right now. The Sora was finally debuted, and you have to keep in mind this has been one of those product releases that I've been saying for now the past year. It will eventually get here, kind of like Godot will eventually show up. What has happened here, however, is that the environments essentially for the creation of video, as one example, have reached a stage where, rather than playing catch, or rather than being in a dominant position, which they would have been if they'd released it, say, a year ago, they're now actually behind a number of other very good video producers. And video is kind of a separate area from the chat type space, not because of the architecture, although it's a little bit different. It's a diffusion model rather than a straight transformer model. But because with video, what you're talking about is essentially a complex set of interactions. I do a lot of digital video production, a lot of AI video production, and it takes me about 10 minutes to produce 5 seconds of video. So, kind of do the math about how much that takes, or even a minute. That's a minute's worth of production is essentially, 12 or so iterations, figure 24, 25 iterations. And that particular process then becomes, when you start talking about the length of these things, that that process of basically putting together that video becomes something where you are spending time basically trying to be able to find the best potential prompts, or in many cases generating images from images and trying to keep those images to a point where the gray goo doesn't get them in the end. And that's even more true with video, where you don't have control from beginning to end of the process. Having said that, I think that digital video is going to be huge. AI video is going to be huge. I think it's the one area where I tend to disagree with this assumption of saying everything's going to normalize it, because it actually works well in the process of iterative development. That I think is one area where AI does shine. And that is, I have a man in the middle. I have someone who's basically looking at each step of the way and saying, use this, don't use this, make these changes, and then use this again. Try to be able to do this, and then aggregate these things into a single long continuous piece, which is really how we do video anyway. If you're not familiar with, video production, it usually involves shooting lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of takes. And then some poor editor is sitting there going, this is good. Damn, there's a car in this one, in this piece about medieval horsemen. And I can't use it, or I can only use a slice of this. All of those things are things that you do with generative AI in much the same way. It's the same process. And I think that's an area, and there are cases like that use case like that, where that successive refinement actually does produce a very good tool for being able to get to where you want to go. And that, that's kind of secondary to the goo, because there's someone who's basically making arbitrary decisions about how to change that and to make the edits necessary to turn this from something that's basically pablum into something that's actually comprehensive. And that, that factor is actually something that you see in other areas, like when you start talking about agents. We've had agents around from the 1960s. This is not new technology. But agents are areas or things that essentially allow you to say, I need to be able to do these steps, and now I want you to allocate and do those. Agents basically only work if you have some way of being able to manage and approve of particular actions. If you basically say, go do this and let it go, then you may end up with asking for, hey, I want to order a watch. And next thing you know, someone drives up with 3 tankers full of coal, because that's basically what happened, because there was no review. And so the generative AI folks don't want that. They want to be able to say, I want to control everything. I want to be able to have everything be a neural network. And it doesn't work that way. It's something that you basically, if you're going to do it, everything here is going to involve some sort of editorial oversight and man in the middle. And that's going to be true regardless of what AI does.
Kurt, I love all these people that are like, oh, agentic AI is going to be a game changer. And I'm like, oh,
No.
You discovered scripting. Congratulations.
Yeah, very much so.
Stateful objects. Who knew?
Yeah, it's funny, and they don't even do stateful objects very well. It's if they did stateful objects well, I'd be a very happy person, because I deal with network systems. No, I mean, it's kind of like it's okay. We're taking a step back 30 years to the point where everything was synchronous and everything was, and you were basically back into not even client server type technologies. So it's no surprise that technologists, architects, people that are making decisions at companies are going, no, maybe not just yet. Maybe we need to rethink this. And that's, I think, fundamental to why I look at where all of this is going, where this is happening, and what's going to happen, what is happening now is that a lot of the investment that was initially made, people are walking away from. They're yeah.
It's a phenomenal meme generator. I'm not entirely certain it was worth $2 trillion, though.
Yeah, I'm certain it wasn't. And the yes, this will eventually realize a return, but one, the architecture is going to have to change. Two, the way that we think about the expectations are going to have to change, and we need to start thinking about AI increasingly as something that's local. Something we this is centralization. Every time you have a new technology, the first thing that happens is we're going to centralize. We're going to basically pull everything in, create a single point of failure, and that single point of failure is going to be massively invested in and make lots and lots of money. But the reality, if you look back at the evolution of tech, is that almost all of these eventually only succeed if they can distribute well. And that means essentially moving away from these big, giant monolithic models and moving down to something that is more responsive, but is smaller, is less intelligent, but is intelligent in certain domains much more effectively.
Because
And
Kurt,
I think
part of the problem here is, or the next hurdle, or maybe what makes the bubble burst is the not only the investment as an enterprise, as an organization, but the physical cost of operating the technology that's required to deal with this, right? I mean, I remember talking in the software automation days, Chris, we go back to the outsourcing days where we used to have conversations about what's the real TCO, total cost of ownership, right? So if you add in the compute requirements, you add in the hardware, the chip deficit right now, the data center deficit right now, and the power and utility constraints that has prompted some of these organizations to try to form public-private partnerships with governments to start building better power infrastructure. We're going to hit a cost, at least a cost bump, if not a cost avalanche at some point. Even the CFO of OpenAI came out kind of hinting at pretty substantial cost increases. I assume it's because of this, right?
I say it all the time. The second law of thermodynamics is a law, not a suggestion. You can, in this universe, as far as we know, you cannot get something for nothing. And unless you're deploying information-based technologies into a growing market, you always take a negative ROI. I'm firmly convinced of that.
Yeah, and the problem is the fines on violating that law are steep, damn steep.
Yes.
I mean, something to keep in mind. What's happening now is that you're seeing companies going in and saying, we need nuclear reactors. Now, think about that. We have basically been stuck on okay, we have nuclear reactors that worked up until about the 1970s. And then we had 3 Mile Island, then we had Chernobyl, then we had the Japanese overlaps, other things along those lines. And in general, we've been very reluctant to get into that area. Now, all of a sudden, everyone is thinking about it, and it's actually in my list of things to watch out for in 2025, which I'm working on now. All of a sudden, people are talking nuclear reactors. They're talking about breeder reactors. They're talking about.
Kurt, I don't know about you, but I am completely comfortable with Zuckerberg, Bezos, and Altman having access to plutonium. What could possibly go wrong?
No, absolutely. Well, I mean, this is also something where I think we're actually going to see the rise of thorium-based systems.
Yep.
And
huge fan of lifters.
And that doesn't necessarily solve the problem. You're still producing uranium, but you're producing uranium-233 rather than 235. You're also, I mean, you actually do. There are some advantages to it. I've got a physics background. I actually am quite familiar with nuclear reactors, and I think that it's probably about time for us to do it. But I just find it funny that this issue is one that's become so is becoming so big primarily because of these huge data centers and because of the fact that we're now getting these systems. And a good example of this, you talk about some of the very high-end NVIDIA chips. I don't remember the designation for it, but one of those, it's about a $70,000 chip that you're talking about. And that chip, the problem with that chip is that it is so big that you can't fit it into a standard server grid. So you have to actually build new server grids. It's also so hot that you basically have to build in massive plumbing and massive pipes to be able to handle that waste heat. And this in turn is part of what's prompting all the discussion about the nuclear reactors, because if you have something that's basically generating so much waste heat and you lose power, what happens? Well, that waste heat basically fries these $70,000, $80,000 chips that are concentrated into very tiny boxes. And your entire, infrastructure becomes one massive meltdown. And it's almost a nuclear meltdown at that point. And that's a real concern right now, because if you have situations like this, it becomes a real question, not only of can I develop the water, or can I develop the electrical power, but can I develop the water? Can I get the water to these systems? And this is actually becoming a very big issue as well. So, it's all interrelated. Can you have the data centers? To a point. You get to a point where it's too big, where you actually need to start diverting rivers to be able to supply this. Then maybe you're at a point where the technology is simply not good enough yet, and you need to kind of scale back your ambitions.
Yep. Well, Kurt, great conversation. I'd love to have you back on in the new year to talk about your list for 2025. It sounds like we only scratched the surface on some of the research you've been doing, but I really appreciate you joining us.
Well, thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Cheers, Kurt.
So, Chris, okay, I was talking about bubbles bursting. We got to nuclear power, but I think this was a great conversation, because we tend to focus on specific issues in a vacuum related to AI. I thought this was a good kind of comprehensive from start to finish, all the different factors that, are both that people are talking about and some of the ones that are not being talked about so much, right?
Well, I hate coming off as anti-technology, because I love technology, but I feel like we need to have sort of cooler heads and be more pragmatic about what it is and is not, and what it is and is not good for. And I think people are kind of finally coming to that realization, but we do this with every new technology, as Kurt said, about every 24 months, we go through this process. The one thing that never changes with technology is us. So generally speaking, we're the problem.
Yeah. Well, good show, Chris. Good. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining us, everybody. We're back Wednesday at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific. In the meantime, if there's anything you're working on, you want some free advice, or just to learn some art of the possible from our team of subject matter experts, visit us at irpaai.com. Chris, have a great week. Have a great week, everybody.
Take care.